Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. We're going to continue our sessions with Mathieu Comandon, a longtime Linux user. Matthew started working on Lutris in 2009 to simplify video game management. He specializes in Python development, both for the Linux desktop and the web. And Lutris was born out of a desire to make Linux a great platform for video games. Thanks to the efforts of the whole community, this is now a reality. Let's take a look at the tools and technologies that have helped us reach this point. Now that we have a solid base, what are the remaining challenges to address in order to keep video games and other legacy software running in the future? The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you for coming. So we're going to talk about video games on Linux, specifically how to keep them running in the long term. Now that we've spent a lot of time and efforts getting games to run properly on Linux, how can we make sure that we keep them running like in the foreseeable future? So first, what is Lutris? It's a gaming platform that is exclusive for Linux, that leverages a lot of things that are quite specific to Linux. It was always meant to be fully open source and use as many open source technology as possible. A lot of people think of Lutris as a wine launcher. It's much more than that. The target is really to launch any game, to facilitate any game on Linux, whether it's wine-based, so Windows game, or if it's native, or it can be emulated, like it can be a console game as well, or from an old computer. When I say conservation, like preservation, it's not necessarily to keep the games in their exact state that they were like when they were released. Tend to favor playability over accuracy. That means that if we can improve the games that were released a long time ago, then we will do so. Mostly thinking about open source re-implementation of some games that do improve the game, that keep them alive. That's the ideal scenario for your game, to keep it alive in like as long as we want to get it open source. Now that we have a good performance, that we have a stable way to play games, the focus has shifted from mostly tinkering with Linux to sort of get your games working, to now just focusing on preservation. Now that we have games running, we'd like to keep them that way. So where do we come from? This has been a long journey. It started about like 98. Pretty much the first, I mean, we had like much more basic games before that, but in 98, Loki started porting games to Linux, and we had like pretty cool games like Unreal Tournament, Quake 3, Rune, a bunch of like I don't know if we called them AAA games at the time, but like some high-end games, like very popular games at the time. And okay, games back then were much more simple than they are now. So it's allowed like a small team to port them. But yeah, already back then we had some pretty good ports. So the same team who did the ports, Loki, created also SDL that is still used up to this day. It's one of the big foundation of gaming on Linux. It handles all the inputs, sound, graphics. It was started by Sam Latinga at Loki, and with the help of Ryan Gordon, who also did a lot of work on SDL. Sadly, Loki went bankrupt in 2001 while they were porting Deus Ex. And after that, we had a period of like a few years where we didn't have a lot of games on Linux. So between 2001 and 2009, it wasn't such a good time for Linux. And it was also the same period where I started using Linux exclusively. So I stopped dual booting, I stopped using Windows, but I still wanted to play some games. Wine was starting to get pretty stable. We could play games, like I remember having a computer that was playing Warcraft 3. I think also World of Warcraft was playable, like from a very early stage. It was showing some good progress, so we could already start using Wine for gaming. At the time, we didn't have a lot of commercial games. There was Linux Game Publishing that did a few ports, and outside of that, there were very few games. Can think of Prey, like the first one from 2006, Serusem 2, Enemy Territory Quake Wars. So that's about it for like the games released in this period. But then, in 2010, a new company appeared called Humble Bundle, and they launched what's called they called Humble Indie Bundle, which required the game to be DRM free and to have a Windows, a Mac, and a Linux version. So that helped incredibly a lot. And we started having a lot of ports, mostly from indie games, but there were a lot of the time really great indie games. So we started having more people who did the ports, a lot more ports. Sadly, maybe not AAA games, but still, we started having a lot more interest in Linux gaming. And at the same time, I started working on Lutris about like 2009, 2010. It was started like I was using some framework from that was publicized in Ubuntu's classrooms. It was a framework started by Didier Roche called Quickly, and that was like pretty much like the basis for creating Lutris. So that was like really a big help to getting me started, because I hadn't done like really GUI programming. Like I didn't know anything about GTK, or I knew just only web development, and that's it. And then in 2012, like we had the really big change when Valve started being interested in Linux, and they started releasing a Linux client for Steam. That's also introduced a lot of companies, a lot of publishers that started being interested in Linux. We have like Square Enix that ported a few ports, a few games. There were Warner as well. I mean, some big publishers started being interested, and also the companies that were doing Mac ports, like Feral, Aspire, and all those companies were also pushing their games on Linux as well. At the same time, Valve also released SteamOS, the Steam machines that really didn't work out, but that were the foundation for what would happen later on. So even though like the Steam machines didn't catch on, this was still the start of something big. The performance wasn't really here back then. You had like games ported by Feral or Asper that didn't have the same level of performance than their Windows counterparts. So that may have explained like the low interest in the Steam machines. And then what I think is the most important thing that happened in Linux gaming, 2016, Vulkan was released. And in my opinion, that was the key points that changed everything. With Vulkan, we had DXVK that appeared like shortly after. So I like to think of Vulkan as a graphics API that is used to write other graphics APIs. So you can use it in your game engine like Unity or Unreal. You can use it to write DirectX, whether DirectX 11, 12, 9. You can write OpenGL, like we are going to have like Zinc being released like soon. I mean, it's doing some really great progress. So yeah, it can be used to translate a graphics API into something more modern that will run on a modern hardware. And with that, Valve also created Proton. Like they put together Wine, DXVK, a bunch of other technologies, and they created like Steam Play that would allow you to run any Windows games on Linux. So there were only like a few games that were like validated from Valve, but you could also choose to run any game from Steam and see how it would go. Basically, it was the same technology that we were using with Lutris, but the only difference is Lutris ships Wine and DXVK and other components separately, whereas Proton is its own whole package. So what about now? In Lutris, we've made a lot of progress since like 2009. We now support all the game consoles until 6th gen. That is, if you're running the current development branch, because I've added an Xbox emulator just a few days ago. So with the Xbox emulator, that means we have support for all consoles up until like the 6th gen. When the Xenia emulator is ready, then we'll also have Xbox 360, which will mean that we'll have 7th gen complete. And 8th gen is also partly supported. We have like Switch, Wii U. Yeah, and it's at this point it's only PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series X that we don't support. And those games, like those platforms, they have very few exclusives. So you'll likely get your games like on the PC as well. Wine has improved a lot, especially since Valve has put a lot of resources into Wine. They have collaborated with Codeweavers the past few years, and that means that Wine has got really good for gaming purposes. So things that I wanted to have like for a long time, like proper support for X input, for example, that started appearing when Valve put a lot of resources. That was not something that we could do on our side. I mean, I don't have the knowledge to write Wine patches. We ship patched versions of Wine, but that's most like we gather like all the patches that we can find pretty much anywhere from any source. We test them, we see if they work. If they do work, we put them into one of our Wine release, and then we ship them. So that means that we have a Wine build that is a bit more compatible with games that either vanilla Wine or Wine staging. So now everything is starting to be Vulkan based. So DirectX 11 is Vulkan, DirectX 12 is Vulkan. A lot of emulators are starting to have a Vulkan backend as well, like CMU, like the Switch emulators, or like a PS3 emulator. They all run Vulkan. So that, as I said, this has been like the crucial points in Linux gaming, because OpenGL was starting to show its limitations. Like the last game that was really using OpenGL was Doom 2016. It was pretty good, but it was really showing its limits. And now Vulkan has permitted a lot of good progress. We also have support for most of the latest stuff like RTX, DLSS. We also have support for anti-cheats, like for the game publishers that do want to enable it. Some publishers sadly don't want, like for example, Bungie with Destiny 2 or Epic Games with Fortnite. They said, oh, we don't want to support Linux, so that's too bad. But other than that, we can have EAC, BattleEye, and all those stuff. So that means that we have very few limits running games on Linux. And like the best thing that happened lately is, of course, the Steam Deck. It's kind of all of those good things that happen put together in a very small package, in a handheld, and you can just carry around a tiny Linux computer that can pretty much play any game you can throw at it. So that's like was a huge accomplishment for everyone who was involved in Linux gaming. So we do try to preserve as many games as possible with Lutris, but we can't preserve everything. Especially now that we are like seeing some kind of transition with like multiplayer games. A lot of games don't see themselves as really video games, but now as live services. We don't have the control over the backend of those games. So once the backend, like the server goes offline, then your game is gone. We don't have like unless someone like reverse engineers like the server, which is very hard, then we can't preserve that, sadly. Kernel level anti-cheats, so not EAC and BattleEye that have like some kind of Linux support, but more thinking about the ones that have that you can see in Valorant or Call of Duty that have also the same principles applied at EAC or BattleEye, but do not have Linux compatibility. Those, the way they're built, it's unlikely that we'll ever get support like on Linux for them. Mobile games, I haven't found a good solution to run them on Linux. I'm not even talking about iOS because that's, I don't think that will be ever possible. But Android, I mean, there should be some Android emulators, but I haven't found them performant enough to run games. Maybe there's something that I haven't seen yet. There are some Windows programs. I think BlueStacks is one of them, but since I don't really run Windows, I haven't tried it. And also, mobile games have a lot of problems with the same problem as with live services. So you have a lot of microtransactions. A lot of it is based on the backend, on the server side. So once that's over, your games are gone. And strangely enough, maybe Linux games, native Linux games, can't really be preserved, or it's getting really hard. So let's see what's that all about. So the way we can run games on Linux is there's different paths we can go. So Wine is like the big one. Wine is used to run most PC games. We also use Lutris runtime that is basically like the same thing as the old Steam runtime, which is basically a collection of .so files that we've taken from Ubuntu 18. We'll have to update that at some point, but basically it's a big collection of libraries that we throw in a folder, and then we do a hack with LD library paths, and it offers like a lot more supports. But it can cause issues. It's not always compatible with all distros, so it has a tendency to break. Like for example with glibc. Steam has started using container-based isolate games into containers to run them. I've also experimented with Docker to run like very old games that had some level of success, but it was not like a full success. Like the GPU, I couldn't pass the GPU to Docker the way I want it to. So that's still not a sure way to preserve games. Then you have emulation, which is a really accurate way to run old games, but also really expensive. And the last and ideal way to get your games running and preserved for the long time is to have them either open sourced or reverse engineered. So we have games like all the Quake games, for example, like the Quake 1, 2, 3, all the Doom games, like you have like for example, Doom that had been like converted to an engine like GZ Doom that can run all the games that are based on the Doom engine. So that's not only a good way to preserve the games, but also a good way to improve on them. And now we see like a whole bunch of new games that are released on the GZ Doom engine that are just brand new stuff that looks pretty great. So now that we have all those games running on Linux, there are some challenges in the near future that we can expect. Ubuntu tried to do it like a few years ago, was to remove 32 bits. That caused a lot of uproar from myself included, but from the whole like Linux gamers community that didn't want to have their 32-bit games like removed from the system. So we still need to have some kind of good way to run 32-bit applications on 64-bit only systems. We can also imagine that will have some transition to ARM, or maybe that will be RISC-V in the near future. So we also need some kind of transition layer to run games like that were mostly made for x86. In the case of emulators, that's already solved. We have most emulators already compiled for ARM, but like for x86 games, it's still a big issue. And we're also seeing operating systems that are read-only, and maybe that's going to be a challenge in the near future. They're not as flexible. I mean, we're seeing like the first example really is SteamOS that is on the Steam Deck. You're really like confined in a restricted environment. So with that system, we had to work on the Lutris Flatpak, and it's still not as compatible as the native Lutris. So there's still a few things that don't work on the Flatpak. So that's also a challenge to address. So regarding ARM specifically, so we were talking about ARM just a little bit a while ago. So there are some solutions to run not only for ARM, but to run x86 applications on any platform. So you have PCEM, that is a full-blown PC emulator. It's very heavy, it's very resource intensive. You need like a really powerful computer to run like a Pentium 2 level PC. So you can play your Windows 98 games on a 3DFX, but you need a really beefy machine for that. So maybe it's still not like a viable solution for recent stuff. I've also experimented with Box86 on a Raspberry Pi, which shows some pretty good signs, like some pretty good performance, given like how tiny Raspberry Pi is. Managed to run Half-Life on it, but still, it's still not here for running like the latest games, especially considering like we don't have like an ARM with really powerful graphics like Radeon or RTX from NVIDIA. If we go away like from the Linux world and we see what's happening on the Mac world, Rosetta has shown like some really good signs of what could be done on a ARM-based platform and run x86 games. So there was some pretty good performance on that side. So we can imagine if we have some kind of similar open source initiative, that we could have some pretty good results. So a newcomer in this field is FaxEmu, and I've seen some demos of FaxEmu. It seemed to be like the most promising emulator for now. I've seen some pretty recent games that were running pretty well. So yeah, that's something to keep an eye on. So yeah, now that we've had like all these efforts, we now have a complete environment for running games. So I don't know if any of you have done that, but last year I've switched one of my PCs to be game only. I've put my most powerful GPU in it, and it's basically become a game console. So that was a bit before like the Steam Deck was released, and I find it great, and I want to keep that going. So yeah, let's find solutions to make sure that not only Linux is like a good gaming platform currently, but let's keep it that way, like for the foreseeable future. Thank you.